You may not have heard of Ironclad Games, a Canadian developer who has fashioned only a handful of titles in their 15-year-long life. They were founded back in 2003 by ex-Rockstar employees, and they didn't actually release anything for 5 years after that, until 2008 rolled around and Sins of a Solar Empire was released to generally positive reviews and pretty strong sales, all with an impressively low budget of under $1 million. And now, while the base Sins game has been around, like I said, for over a decade at this point, today I'm looking at Rebellion, a sort of standalone expansion, sort of sequel, sort of re-release, put out 4 years later in 2012. So let's not waste any time. Even back before Sins received a healthy amount of DLC and expansions, it was a success both commercially and critically. The game's concept made it immediately interesting for strategy fans, as it blended gameplay from traditionally RTS and traditionally 4X games into a deep, tactical and exciting hybrid of the two. The payoff for this decision was apparent immediately after release, with review scores nearing a 90% average and multiple awards proving its success. The game sold over 200,000 copies within its first month alone, and with its small budget it's easy to see how the game was a financial achievement for Ironclad. Within 2 years the game received 2 expansions, and a package including all 3 products in one for newcomers. And then, something interesting happened. In 2012, Sins of a Solar Empire Rebellion was released on Steam as a standalone expansion to the base game, but what's interesting is while being labelled an expansion, it included everything released before it, as well as the new content it brought to the table. Therefore, while it's technically an add-on to the original Sins of a Solar Empire, it kind of invalidates the Trinity package that was released beforehand, because what that means is that if you want the definitive Sins of a Solar Empire experience, you buy Rebellion. So with that out of the way, let's see what makes Sins the beloved strategy game that it is. Although Sins is classified as a real-time strategy game, it's best described as a mix of traditional RTS and 4X games, such as Galactic Civilization or Endless Space. There's no story mode in the game, it's purely focused on skirmish battles, and whether that's against the AI or real people, you can do them by yourself or co-op. There's an opening cinematic in the game that briefly explains the situation, and to be honest, it does a pretty good job in telling you what you need to know to get you going in terms of the story and the background, which, to be fair, isn't a lot, but that's okay for a game like this. There are 3 races, and each have 2 factions that focus on different aspects of their civilization. While each race is easily distinguishable visually, their research trees and unit types aren't as diverse as you might think. While there are some specific abilities, bonuses, and maybe a couple of buildings and ships that are unique to each race, mostly they're similar in things like the ship classes and the buildings that can be constructed, except for a couple of outliers. And although that sounds like I'm spitting it as a negative, I actually think it works well in a game like this, as it means you can play each race without having to relearn all of your previous knowledge and just pick up a couple of new things along the way. An example of this is that while everyone can build the massive military space stations known as starbases, only the tech have the opportunity to build 2 in one system, and only the Visari have the ability to move theirs after they've been built. There's things like this that are in place throughout many of the game's ships and buildings and research, and in my opinion it's unique enough that each race truly feels like their own without being too similar and just feeling like they've been copied. What is perhaps the most defining factor inside of each faction is their Titan, a massive warship that can only be fielded after a ton of research and a lot of financial investment. It's kind of like a wonder in Age of Empires, except that these are bristled with turrets and missile launchers and will destroy enemy fleets and planets. Having a unique Titan for each faction means there's a choice of 6 unique space-hulking monsters for you to try out, and they each have different strengths and weaknesses which align with their faction's defining features. For example, there is a Tech Titan that focuses on defense, which is basically just a flying fortress, while the other Tech Titan is extremely aggressive and is what looks like just an enormous flying gun with engines on the back. And even though you can only bring one of these to bear at a time, they are basically as strong as an entire fleet, especially when they get upgraded and they can take down a whole fleet without really blinking. So they're not easy to take down, and if you were able to have more than one in a game, it'd probably be pretty overpowered. So when you start a game of Sins, you begin with one planet under your control, and the goal is to expand and capture more planets throughout the star system, or multiple in some cases. And you'll be conquering your enemies by fielding huge fleets with a variety of frigates, cruisers, capital ships, and the previously mentioned Titan if you're lucky. There is diplomacy in the game, but you don't need me to tell you that the fun is in fielding massive warships and throwing them at each other until one of you wins. Sins features large-scale maps ranging from one solar system to multiple galaxies that, as you might have noticed by the footage on screen, make absolutely no astronomical sense in terms of planet layout or anything like that. But that's okay, we're playing a video game here. The scale in the game is impressive. You can zoom in from a view of the entire galaxy into the smallest trade ship, all without stutters or frame drops, even without a monster PC. And while on the topic of performance, the game only has issues, really, when you get into the middle of massive battles, which is fair enough when you can consider that these can include literally hundreds of individual ships, all which are firing their own lasers and missiles and have their own engine trails and everything else. Speaking of lasers, the visual effects in Sins are really nice, and seeing bolts of plasma and laser beams from ships in combat always catches my eye. The designs of the ships and buildings also look great, and they're really visually distinctive, so you can easily tell which ships are from which species, something you'll appreciate in those massive battles with all those ships. The depth offered in Sins is apparent across all aspects of the game, not just in the size of its maps. The research trees are massive and they cover multiple aspects of managing your nation, as you'd expect in a game like this. So you've got military, technology, diplomacy, and fleet research, which can get your fleets to truly ridiculous sizes. Because of all this stuff to build, research, and conquer, a game of Sins can go on for a long time. And because of that, there's the internal joke among my friends of having a quick game of Sins when you've only got, say, half an hour. Even the smallest maps in Sins can take at least a few hours, and a multiple game with over 100 stars can take as long as time itself if you let it. But its length means games are intensely satisfying, and since there's so many decisions to be made throughout a match, no game of Sins is ever the same as the last. While the gameplay in Sins is top class, and the effects are really great as well, the audio definitely leaves a bit to be desired. Although it's impressive to be able to zoom in from the entire galaxy to that of the smallest fighter and hear its own lasers shooting at another ship, the sounds from them, as well as other things like explosions and engine effects, lack a bit of a punch and they come off a bit flat or muffled, which is a bit of a shame as, like I said, the visual effects are really good, so it would have been nice to have the audio as great as those were. They're not too bad, but it's just something I noticed. And there are obviously a few that stand out which are really good, such as like alien plasma fire, but overall it is a wee bit disappointing. Since the game does include a real story mode, I never really expected much from the voice acting, and I was right to do that. It's about what you'd expect, with massive powerful human ships having typically loud and aggressive voices, while their cybernetic religious counterparts, the Advent, can't stop talking about their strength and unity with way too much enthusiasm.
Vengeance shall be ours. Show no mercy. Your suffering begins now.
Bombs away! Give me something to bomb.
Last in the audio section is the soundtrack, which is similar to what you'd find in other strategy games where it's more just background noise than anything else. While it works to set the scene of whatever's happening in the game, it's pretty forgetful, and along with the rest of the audio experience, it takes a backseat to both the gameplay and the visuals. In fact, most of the people I play Sins with actually just turn the music off, as we're normally playing co-op and it just gets in the way of communicating more than everything else. Plus, in a 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 20, 100 hour game, the tracks can start repeating and they get a tad annoying, so you might just want to play your own music or forgo the music entirely. Once Rebellion launched as the quote-unquote definitive Sins experience, people didn't really expect any more content to be released after that, as at that point we'd already seen around 4 years of new additions to the game. However, we were mistaken, as Ironclad did end up developing and releasing 3 more, more smaller sized, bite-sized DLC packs for players over the next few years. From 2013 to 2016 we received Forbidden Worlds, Stellar Phenomena, and Outlaw Sectors, which all included small but nice and welcome additions that were just available for a few dollars, so the value was there. Plus, if your friend bought them but you didn't, you can still play multiplayer. Whoever was the host would load their DLC, which is a nice wee touch. The real post-launch story with Rebellion though is definitely in its mods. While the original Sins saw some great community-made content throughout its life, the ones that are available for Rebellion really shine above the others. It's actually similar to Star Wars Empire at War, which I looked at a wee while back, in that there's a good chance that your favourite sci-fi franchise exists as a free download for Sins of Solar Empire Rebellion on ModDB, made by dedicated community members who love the source material just as much as you. Taking a quick look, you can see we've got Stargate, Star Wars, Free Space, Halo, Mass Effect, and of course Star Trek, with arguably the game's most complete and popular mod coming in the form of Star Trek Armada 3, an incredibly high caliber project that sees the series' iconic races, ships and lore paired with Sins' deep and satisfying gameplay. If you're looking for one of the best Star Trek games period, this mod is a solid contender, and playing that mod against the Borg, knowing you're going to lose against a Borg cube, is an interesting experience when you can put 5 hours into a game knowing how it's going to end. But it is fun to see how big of a defense you can mount until your inevitable destruction. As much as I love older, classic RTSs like Rise of Nations, Impossible Creatures, and Age of Empires, I've got to say that for me, Sins of a Solar Empire trumps all of them in terms of my enjoyment and interest in playing them nowadays. Out of all the strategy games I've looked at over the past month or two, Sins is my easiest recommendation to play in 2018. It's just so good at what it does. It provides a deep, satisfying game experience while still being exciting, action-packed, and thoroughly entertaining throughout. Not only is it a good game, there's first-party multiplayer support that are still up and running from Ironclad, which means if you want to play with friends, or just the AI, you'll have no problem doing either, which is great. The only downside is that the game is slightly on the expensive side, with Rebellion costing about $40 on Steam at the time of recording, though I found it does go on sale relatively often, so if that's too much, just give it a few weeks or a few months and you'll probably be able to find it a bit cheaper. But if you're a fan of the genre and have that money available, I can easily recommend Sins as one of those games that can just provide hours upon hours of entertainment, and earns this place as one of, if not my favourite strategy game of all time. And soon enough, it might just become yours. Thanks everyone so much for watching, we'll see you next time.